And with that, please take it away.
Thank you so much for having me. I should have asked this before, but I'm going to share my screen. Does that work? Do I have
Yeah,
permission?
sounds
Cool.
good.
Share. Hopefully this will work. My screen's black, but hopefully something will happen soon. Okay, can you see?
Yeah, that
Okay,
that looks
cool.
great.
Great. All right, so thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Some of the people who I'm really big fans of a lot of the work that EDF puts out in this space and adaptation and the intersection of economics and adaptation. So climate services, the business of physical risk. Can I share my slides? Here we go. So climate risk, so climate services is commonly known in the private sector as, I think it's more commonly known as climate analytics. And it's really a huge and booming business. It started growing a few years ago. I think one of the most prominent early acquisitions was when Moody's bought 427, which was one of like the early startups in purveyors of climate analytics, which is mostly like information about near to medium term physical impacts like heat waves and wildfires and floods. So there's new data providers entering this space, selling this information at a granular asset level. There's been a lot of mergers and acquisitions in this space. This was just in the years 2019 to 2021, and I would say it's really accelerated since then. There's been a lot of mergers. So Moody's, very interestingly, both bought 427 and also RMS, which is one of the leading catastrophe modelers, really one of the two biggest catastrophe modelers out there. So Moody's now has both of those tools at its disposal. South Pole was bought by ISS, which is a shareholder advisory service. They're very influential in how shareholders vote their proxy shares. S&P bought the climate service. Jupiter Intelligence has remained independent, as has First Street Foundation. And both of these climate analytics providers are widely used both in the private and public sectors. And First Street Foundation is often used in academic work as well. So this project sets out to answer a set of questions. The first is where are companies and investors getting this information from? And how should regulators design and evaluate physical risk disclosure requirements? This has been a really growing area. There's been critiques from abroad that financial regulators are rolling out physical risk disclosure requirements that doesn't really meet the limits of what we know scientifically and doesn't respond to uncertainty appropriately. And what are potential regulatory concerns in the private analytics space? And this includes quality concerns, accuracy, and transparency about the information and where it's coming from and the models. Unequal access to this information, it can be really expensive. And insufficient supply in general, there's going to be a huge growing need for this information in the future. Competition in this space, and are there barriers to entry in the current market? So it's a big question. Where does private sector climate risk come from? So there's a lot going on in this slide. This slide says one version of the information, and the next slide is going to say the same information in a maybe slightly more user-friendly way. But the key bit of this slide, if you can see my cursor, the GCMs are global climate models. I'm actually going to skip right to the next slide, and we'll come back to this one. Global climate models. These are huge, big, physics-based models that are so big they run on the world's biggest supercomputers. So most of the world's developed countries, they only have one each. The US has 3. But they really take an enormous amount of computing power. And they basically are just like thousands and thousands of differential equations that try to represent interactions between the atmosphere and the oceans. And over time, they've incorporated more and more processes. So only the governments have these. All of the different global climate models information is dumped into this big public database called the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project, or CMIP. The latest CMIP was CMIP 6. It's a big public database of all the GCM outputs. So what that means is, and this is a part of how GCMs work, is that they break the Earth down into these big 60 by 60 mile cubes. So they output information, the data that they are actually outputting is at the level of 60 by 60 by 60 miles. So they'll input temperature rise under a certain emission scenario at a certain date and time, but in this 60 by 60 mile cube. It might also have information about precipitation, increased or decreased precipitation. However, at this level of the 60 by 60 mile grid, that's sort of too big to be particularly useful to people interested in making financial decisions or even certain adaptation decisions about where to locate property, or what the risk is going to be to a certain piece of infrastructure like a dam or a house or a luxury condo. You want to get information that's more granular than 60 by 60 miles. So what scientists do in this space is a method called downscaling, which is basically just applies an algorithm to the data at this higher level using historical weather data to try to get a more granular prediction of what the climate impacts will be at a smaller location. This information then gets fed into, ideally, this is sort of what the most advanced climate analytics are doing, like the 427s of the world. They're often using downscaling and then feeding that downscaled information into an impact model, which might tell you information about how temperature rise in that area will manifest in certain ways, like wildfire. And so they'll try to generate like a wildfire score for that GPS place or that housing unit in particular. So the private sector operates all down here. This is all public. Only governments have big supercomputer global climate models. The private sector operates here, including, so there's actually, so when you, in the engineering world, there's actually a big difference between like what the risk will be, like what's the likelihood of a fire happening here or a flood happening here. And there's a difference between projecting that and answering the question, how will a wildfire or a flood happening here actually manifest in damage? How vulnerable is this asset that I'm interested in insuring or adapting? And there's sort of a disconnect. Often right now, some of the leading players up until recently were really just trying to sell you like a heat score or a wildfire score or a flood score without necessarily information about like how that wildfire would manifest in a given asset. To do that, and this is often what insurers do and engineers do, really requires a lot of geospatial data and a lot of other information beyond global climate models. So you need stuff like construction material. When were the houses built? Were they built before or after a housing code? What are the roofs made out of? And a lot of the private sector operates in that space also, using satellites to collect a bunch of geospatial data that they'll then process and sell. Feel free to ask questions as I go along in this presentation too, if you feel like you want to interject. Okay, so we'll move on from there. So this is basically the same thing as this, represented in a different scale. I just want to add that insurance companies are doing something slightly different. They operate in this space using catastrophe risk models, which are, unlike global climate models, designed for very specific locations and really draw from a lot of very granular exposure data. They're really like, one of the things that catastrophe models bring to the table is more consideration of construction material and adaptation steps and how actually like the risk will manifest at certain locations. There's a big debate about whether these catastrophe risk models, which are ideal for capturing tail risks, things that we don't have in the record, there's a big debate about whether these catastrophe risk models are really incorporating well the information that we have from the global climate model. So that's one big debate that's happening in the sector right now. However, the benefit of catastrophe risk models is precisely their ability to focus on specific locations and tail risks. So one of the problems of this entire approach of downscaling these big 60 by 60 mile cubes is that this process, we know this both from like empirical observed data and also just from like our understandings of how these climate models are built. They're not good at catching tails. They're not great at predicting the like very rare extreme events or how climate change will like manifest, how the effect of climate change on the rare catastrophic risk. Global climate models are simply not built to do that. They're not weather models. They're built to predict long-term averages. They're not built to predict hurricanes. So that's actually one of the major limitations of like using global climate models to predict asset level risk, is that they're not great at capturing tail events, including extreme heat waves and extreme like polar vortex events, let alone wildfire events, because there's no trees in the model, for example. So there's this big, what I just said about the differences between like the global climate models and the catastrophe models, this is manifested in a sort of PR fight. And so one useful but imperfect way to frame differences in approaching climate modeling or climate analytics is climate models versus cat models. I don't think this is totally fair. I think the way forward is to combine both of these approaches. But for example, you have Jupiter Intelligence, which is a traditional like climate analytics. They're working with big CMIP data and downscaling it to a certain location. They're saying cat models, whatever, they're fine. Like they're useful for some things, but they're not very good at considering climate risk, so don't use them. Then alternatively, you have Aon, a big catastrophe modeler, saying actually cat models are so much better. So this is saying there's an interesting debate simmering at the moment as to whether catastrophe models or climate risk models are best for modeling the financial impacts of physical climate risk. So I don't think it really makes sense to say like either or. I do think that a big point of the paper is to point out that like we need to approach granular level extreme risk with a catastrophe approach. We need to like really understand that simply using averages from the global climate models is missing so much risk exposure data. And that's, when you leave, and so to zoom out, that's really a major critique with like most of the leading straight up like climate economic models at the macroeconomic level at this moment in time. So for example, the Network for Greening the Financial System, it's this big like coalition of central banks and supervisors that roll out supervisor information for how central banks should do stress testing and scenario analysis for the financial institutions under their purview. Even the Network for Greening the Financial System, until very recently, most of the physical risk climate scenarios they were using relied solely and only on downscaled, or not even downscaled, just like they only relied on outputs of the global climate models, which meant that they were relying on like very aggregated information, like regional warming, or like regional precipitation. I think they only even considered regional warming and regional precipitation change. And so one of the big critiques is like regional warming and regional precipitation change is only really useful for certain types of questions. It's not very useful for like lots of types of infrastructural questions, which really matters for extreme events. Some of the more sophisticated approaches, and we'll get to this more at the end of the talk, is really trying to combine these like traditional economic approaches, which simply apply the outputs of the averages from GCMs, and trying to use like more Monte Carlo approaches and more risk-based statistical approaches like catastrophe modeling to try to get the tails better. So one way of saying this is top-down models, macroeconomists, industry strategists. They ask questions like, how much will climate impacts hurt GDP? How much of the world needs to be off coal by 2035 in order for us to avoid the worst climate impacts? These are the types of questions asked in top-down models. Bottom-up models, these are the types of models used by insurance companies and engineers. They're much more like specifically focused on one location. They ask questions like, how high should I build this seawall? How much should I price wind insurance? So my critique really is that this top-down world of macroeconomists really needs to learn from the bottom-up strategies to understand how to approach like decision-making under uncertainty, which is really such a huge problem when it comes to like predicting climate impacts. And in addition to like forecasting tail risk. So the takeaway is that combining them is key, especially over long timescales and geographies. It's extremely a work in progress. So what are the problems with the private sector US climate services right now? There's very unequaled access. This data can be really expensive, even from First Street Foundation, which like is a nonprofit and really has marketed itself as very like open source and open access. It's very expensive even to buy like state level data, flood data, for example. And from the more private providers, can really get up into like the millions of dollars for a data set. The stuff that is public is not particularly usable, doesn't necessarily come in the format that's usable. A lot of these providers just simply use black box models, so it's really hard for users and financial institutions to interrogate the methods that are being used by these data providers. There's been a growing set of literature and like quotes from scientists in the media really questioning some of the like very specific forecasts and claims of like wildfire risk in this zip code in 2050, things that we just like really don't know enough about at that level to say with maybe the level of certainty that it's being pitched around. So that's really a concern. I think we do need to, I'll skip the who's version of the future because I'll highlight that in a future slide. I think that we really need to think about the general privatization concerns. So there's really good scholarship on the negative knock-on effects that happen from privatizing a lot of our weather services, including the fact that like weather forecasting and also climate forecasting is just like necessarily a systemic endeavor. Like everybody needs everyone else's data, like climate and weather is like sort of all about understanding how weather around the world will like eventually come to affect you. And so privatizing it both has like really disadvantaged a lot of lower income countries that like can no longer just access US weather data information, and really leads to like a sort of a walling up and a siloing of information that really needs to be free. And I think is fundamentally a public good. Similarly, physical risk is like in a very similar way, systemic. So just buying a data set from 427, for example, of like what your flood risk will be to a certain condo, it's not that useful up to a certain point. Like you can invest in a condo that might have zero flood risk, but like what if the surrounding municipality has a lot of flood risk? What if the roads leading to that town get wiped out? What if there's a famine and there's like a big systemic risk that you didn't even think of? So there's obviously like a limit to what individual private sector decision makers feel like they need to take into account. Maybe they don't feel like thinking about famine is like within their purview, but there's certainly a lot of, and we've learned this post-COVID, there's certainly like a lot of supply chain risks and transport issues, like major transport rivers drying up, like the Mississippi River drying up. People are realizing that they're exposed to physical risks that actually like aren't even within their own asset portfolio. And that, to me, that is like one other argument in favor of more disclosure of this information because it is useful for a broader range of actors. So yeah, this is the Hughes version of the future point. I do think that financial regulators need to consider whether or not they're all using the same model too much. And so there's some divergence. There's 3 different providers. There's First Street Foundation, Jupiter Intelligence, and Moody's. But at some point in the European Union, the ECB was using Moody's data from 427. And so were a lot of the banking regulated entities. They were like also buying and using 427's data. So it was just this moment where it seemed like the regulator and the regulatee were using the same models, which might have the same flaws. And I don't think there's been a lot of high level thinking about, do we want Moody's RMS doing all the like Federal Reserve's banking stress test models, for example? And I do sort of think that's the world we exist in at this moment. And I just think this is really a broader argument for like more federal capacity for doing these models on our own, rather than like, I think it's a little ridiculous that Fannie Mae had to license this data from First Street. I think we need to think about more public provision of this information. So this space is currently mostly unregulated, except in very specific state level insurance proceedings. But the review is largely minimal. So Florida is the very interesting exception. And there's like policy debates that are burbling up in California right now also around supervision of catastrophe models. And Florida has like a pretty developed, and I would say pretty well working, although I'm saying that's controversial, oversight process of catastrophe models. And we could maybe borrow from that process. These questions are increasingly intersecting with regulated decision-making beyond insurance. So insurance agencies are using this information. This information is being used to describe certain things to investors. So the Securities and Exchange Commission's first ESG task force on securities fraud. Like their first settlement was with a mining company who had told investors that its tailings dam was safe. And then after an extreme weather event, the tailings dam was in fact not safe. I sort of think that's the tip of the iceberg in terms of the types of cases we'll see about, failure to adapt, or you said that this was going to be resilient and it turned out not to be resilient. Like, what should you have known at the time, given the science? I really think this is like early days in the legal world, but it's coming like very quickly that these types of cases will be in front of judges. So yeah, I point out in a recent FERC ruling, the energy regulator spent like pages on the methodologies and uncertainties of downscaling, for example, when approving a PG&E hydropower project. So this is right around the corner. And the uses in the private sector are growing, especially in enterprise risk management. So, which I think is frankly a good thing. I think it's good that supermarket companies are asking climate scientists, consultants to tell them about their exposures to crop failures in various parts of the world. I do worry that then we have an interest in making sure that these models are somewhat correct if we can. Cat bonds are really on the rise, which use catastrophe models. They're really being pushed in adaptation finance internationally, and they're being used in asset pricing. So Woodwell Asset Management, for example, which is the largest active asset manager in the US, they have a partnership with climate scientists to provide this asset level information. Lots of jurisdictions are rolling out new updated physical risk disclosure requirements. So here, so part of the flaws in this system it's also on the regulators. It's really important that they don't demand information that it might not make that much sense to ask individual corporations to disclose. And it's not clear to me, at least even looking at the European Union requirements, that there's been like a involved discussion with the climate scientists about like what it would take to produce some of this information and whether it's really like worth the computing power to make every single company compute this information. I think we need to take a step. I would advocate for taking a step back and thinking about what makes sense to ask companies to disclose at the physical risk level. So I borrowed this from Jupiter Intelligence. This is just like a marketing thing from them. But this is them. So this is all the things the European Union is rolling out in the CSRD. They're asking both for chronic and acute risks and disclosures of all these different things, including like glacial lake outbursts and tornado risk and solifluction. So Jupiter Intelligence is saying like, okay, all the green things we can just sell you a data set for. All the yellow things we can like tell you some stuff about because the science behind them is actually like really, it's like very hard to predict landslides, like incredibly difficult. And then some of it's like, we're not going to sell you this because asking for this data is like sort of silly. I do wish that the regulators had maybe like done more work on their end to sort of think about what would be a good thing to prioritize in the disclosure, but there's also sort of a different approach to rulemaking in the European Union. On the US side, the Federal Insurance Office is trying to make all the insurance companies disclose risk data at the zip code level for a set of like 13 states or something, or maybe 20 states, I forget. The insurance companies are fighting it. I don't know what the update on that is going to be. The Securities and Exchange Commission, they are going to finalize, finally, their climate risk disclosure rule. In the proposed rule, the physical risk disclosure requirements were like very vague. I don't know what they're going to look like really in the finalized rule. So about this time or even earlier last year, the Federal Reserve unrolled its required climate scenario analyses for the 5 largest American banks. For the transition scenarios, for the emission scenarios, they simply borrowed the scenarios from the Network for Greening the Financial System, which I mentioned earlier with this big coalition of central banks and supervisors. But in part, or I think mostly in light of the fact that the NGFS scenarios for physical risk had really been criticized for like all the reasons I've been laying out, that these like macroeconomic models that have damage functions that simply input global average temperature rise as like the input to the damage function, that's like not really a sensical way of thinking about physical risk manifesting in the real economy. It doesn't really think about like the major tipping points in the physical system that could really impact the economy, like a major hurricane wiping out the Gulf Coast energy distribution network, or, you know, a major Mississippi River drying out for a long time, or like some things that seem sort of likely. Like it seems like a lot of aquifers in the West are just like going to dry out in my lifetime. So it's been really criticized. The large macro econ models have really been criticized. It seems like the Fed was trying to respond to those criticisms by asking the big banks to model a large hurricane hitting the New York region. Unfortunately, I mean, I think the takeaway here is that if economists, like, you really need to get climate scientists involved in these conversations. The group that rolled out this stress test, I think, was primarily economists. They just asked this question, which was basically like, banks, model a large hurricane hitting the East Coast region, hitting your portfolios under two emission scenarios, like a medium emission scenario and a high emission scenario. And it was just sort of, that's just an odd science way to ask the question, given that we just don't really know enough about like hurricane sensitivity to climate change under those two emission scenarios in a very specific region of New York. It's just asking sort of an impossible science question and putting it on the banks to provide whatever information they want. I think they just should have, there's, you know, one, they're missing like a lot of low hanging, or to me, like, they're missing a lot of stuff that we simply know about climate change. Like, rather than asking this thing about hurricanes in 2050 in New York City, which we don't know that much about, there's, to me, like a whole host of things that we do know a lot about that could impact the financial system. And two, they could have maybe just done what like Lloyd's does when they're doing stress tests, is like simply given the banks a hurricane. Like, rather than ask this like very complicated question about the relationship between climate change and hurricanes, they could have just said like, here's a big hurricane that the scientists say is possible. Now you think about the impact. So I don't know. I think we can talk way more if you want in the Q&A about the way forward. I have a new project thinking about climate scenarios because they are becoming a much bigger and widely used tool. Both for the regulators, but also by like the financial actors themselves are unveiling these like sort of dramatic and very depressing climate scenarios. So yeah, I'm going to wrap up soon to ask for some, so we can open up for some questions. But this is not just about like corporations. This is not just about like picking on corporations. It's really about trying to get the science correct in order to prepare at all different levels, the banking sector included. But so yeah, so the paper I'm presenting opens with this anecdote of the Oregon legislature asking the University of Oregon to make a wildfire map. And there was really a negative public outcry in response to this wildfire map. People were really upset. They thought that the insurance companies were exiting Oregon, like in response to this wildfire map, that they thought the reason that they couldn't get their own wildfire insurance was because of this map. And there's a big fight, and eventually the government of Oregon had to withdraw the map entirely. Meanwhile, if you just log on to realtor.com, you can see your house's fire factor score from First Street Foundation. And there's no like appeals process available to you if you think that information is difficult. It's actually really hard to dig into them. I mean, there's not like a lot of, I think for fire factor, they actually do have sort of an open methodology of how they modeled some of the risk. But for some of the critiques for First Street Foundation, how the exact the database that the methodology is drawing upon is not available if you want to dig into that information, unlike decision making that happens in the government sector. So I'm really arguing that we need to have a huge investment in providing this, in like calculating and providing this information, both mostly at the federal level. But I think it needs to be dispersed throughout the states. I think it needs to be like a lot of investment in local government science capacity as well. We need a centralized, well-funded resource to provide this information. And Biden's All of Climate initiative means that all of these different government agencies, including the Securities and Exchange Commission, OCC, which is the banking regulator, FDIC, they all have these climate risk mandates, and none of them really have in-house expertise. There's no scientists on staff to help with like translating and understanding these data in this model. So I really think we need to better integrate the economic agencies with the science agencies. And, so this isn't the newest idea. This idea that we need to have a national climate service has actually been around since the 1970s, I discovered, and has been every so often. There's a new heightened call for a national climate service. NOAA every so often is like, people really want all this climate information and they don't know where to go. It'd be really great if we could have this centralized process. So one con to this argument has been that having a centralized agency can't meet all needs for all people. And we need to have more of a dispersed expertise that is located in different agencies and in different places around the country, including maybe investing a lot in land-grant universities, for example, to work with the existing climate scientists to do more adaptation science that is accessible throughout the country. This is my final slide. This is just sort of the latest update to trying to get the climate economic models to better reflect granular tail risk. The Council of Economic Advisors released this right before Christmas this year. Progress report on climate energy macro modeling. They released a memorandum that says, therefore, the Council of Economic Advisors, OMB, and Treasury, in consultation with OSTP, should coordinate with NOAA EPA to develop a plan, basically to create a national catastrophic modeling platform able to quantify extreme weather risks, integrating the effects of climate change, and provide recommendations on agencies suitable to host such a platform. So it does seem like, and similarly, the President's Council of Advisors on Science Technology, this happened in April of 2023, they also argued that we really need to have a really strengthened and well-funded boost in our adaptation science. So we have really well-funded, super state-of-the-art global climate models, and we're really good at atmospheric science, but we need to have more of a focus and more of a push, including building out catastrophe modeling capabilities at understanding granular spatially granular risk throughout the country. And this is what PCAST advocated for, and the Council of Economic Advisors agreed in December. So I'm excited to see what will happen for a national catastrophe modeling platform. And I'll end there, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Madison. That was fantastic. We have a couple questions in the chat. So I think I'll first go to Katie Anderson, if you wanted to ask your question.
Yes, hi, this is Katie Anderson, though I look like Joe. I'll turn on my video so hi everyone. Thank you so much. That was really interesting. I really appreciated your point specifically. So I work for our EDF Plus business team. And so I really appreciated your point about, hey Joe, sorry. I really appreciated your point about disclosure and how, we're increasing climate disclosure needs for companies specifically, which is a good thing, but potentially we're asking folks to disclose things that we don't have confidence in or can't actually disclose, or aren't even that critical compared to other things that we should maybe be doubling down on. So I would love to get your thoughts on, from a scientific perspective, what are the things that if we could just simplify down disclosure to just a few things, what would you be focusing on, or how would we get an answer to that question?
Man, I've thought about this so much and I don't have a good answer. So I'll say some things. So it was very interesting to me that, again, Wellington, the biggest active asset manager in the US, the thing that they kept pressing the SEC to require was simply where the stuff is. They were let us do the risk assessment. We have climate scientists on staff. We don't need corporations to have in-house climate scientists. And this is actually my own experience. The reason I got into this whole world was that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund hired my postdoc advisor to figure out their exposure to water risk in the mining industry from climate change. And it was amazing to me that the hardest thing to figure out was where they got their water from. You could even be hello, I'm from your largest shareholder. Tell us where you, do you use groundwater? And it was impossible to get that information. It was in an Excel file from the dude at the mine in northern Chile. So That's really interesting to me. Like the fact, so Wellington was literally like, we just want all the companies to tell us where their stuff is. And I know from consultants actually that like you'd think that that would be an easy thing for companies to disclose. And like a lot of companies don't even know where their own stuff is. So I don't know where you begin then, really. Like then asking them to be like, what's the tornado risk to all your stuff is just like such a ridiculous question if they like don't even know where it is. Like, I don't know. In law, this really matters because it's sort of like, or at least in legal theory, like whose job is it? Like, is it sort of the board's job to like thinking about like the exposure to risk, or like is it the investor's job to like understand the risk exposure through specific assets? Yeah, I don't know. Great question.
Well, and then also what we found on the business side is that people are now, you know, sucking up like 5 full-time employees just to do disclosures, to try to find all of that information. And we're kind of like, okay, we certainly want disclosure because it increases accountability and it makes it creates, you know, a business case for action, but we don't want to use all of the resources of the organization to deploy on sustainability just for disclosure. And so like, what's that sweet spot is something that I'm really interested in. And so as you learn more, please share it with EDF.
Yeah, okay, will do. Thanks.
Dave, go ahead.
So Madison, I wanted to thank you so much for the talk. It was great. I have very little experience here, so I'm going to say something and then you can tell me if it's wrong or not. But I was curious about, I know there's asset managers, like you mentioned, there's also BlackRock. I know that they have their own internal climate team, climate modeling team. And I was curious about what they rely on, if you know anything about that. But then also, I know large insurance companies are updating their understanding of climate and like the potential, you know, probability of wildfire risk and that sort of thing. And I was wondering, are they all relying on the same models? And then do they have their own internal models? Can we learn from what these private companies are doing? Are they like less likely to share what they know? Because you know, it gives you a competitive edge in a way if you have an internal understanding. But I feel like we could be learning from companies and figure out how to, you know, protect assets in other parts of the economy. Just questions.
Yeah. So yeah, BlackRock hired its first like on-staff climate scientist, I think in like 2021. I don't know exactly what they're doing. I mean, so here's the thing. Certainly what they're doing is taking in like the big CMIP data and like doing stuff to it, maybe downscaling, maybe doing something else. They don't have their own supercomputer climate model. So that's just, to me, that just sort of matters because I feel like, at least when I do like law and econ talks, there's this assumption that like we need the private sector because like only they are good at things. And so sometimes I just want to drive home the point that like, no, like only the government has the big supercomputers and like literally only like those are the only climate science, like they're only public atmospheric big global climate scientists that work in these models, which to me is a point that it's worth making. So yeah, and also in your question, okay, so this is the thing I don't really I mean, I understand some of the catastrophe modeling space, but it's fascinating to me. It does seem like once you get to like the reinsurer level, there's maybe like 2 big catastrophe models. Like if you're insuring in Miami, you either use the like air insurance model or IRMS. Yeah, you either use Moody's RMS or you use air or Verisk has been they like relabeled to called Verisk. There's like smaller, more boutique firms. Like there's this one, so Karen Clark, who basically like invented catastrophe modeling in the 90s, she has her own consultancy. It just doesn't seem like there's a lot of players given how much these matter and also how many downstream players there are, meaning like there's a bunch of insurers competing with one another using the same cat model. They just probably input different assumptions. Maybe they use like different, you know, they have different people like tweak the models on their end or like add different risk assumptions or their own like cutting edge like piece of data to try to get an edge. But I think fundamentally there's just kind of like 2 big cat models for different regions. In the EU, there's this big open source OASIS cat modeling thing that I don't know enough about, but there's like a big project to have more open source catastrophe modeling capabilities that I think was initially launched as sort of like a developing world facing project, but now is more of like more broadly construed as just like an adaptation resource for everyone. I don't know. I mean, they have like conferences around it and everything. I just don't know enough about it, but yeah.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Lisa.
Hi, thanks so much for this great talk. And I wanted to ask more about the prescription for the problem, sort of. I guess the Oregon fire story is really interesting, and I pasted in the chat another one about Texas, requiring now to disclose flood risk, and it's affecting property values. And I'm noticing, you had the government map that was forced to be withdrawn, but then you said, these like listings basically just have it built in. So the black box nature is a problem, but I also wonder in our sort of society right now, it feels like government products or government maps are often, we think that they have a lot of credibility. I think they have a lot of credibility, but sometimes they're actually resisted just as much because people don't trust the government. They think the government it's a takings if you've updated the flood map, so you've updated the fire risk map. And the fact of the matter is, we know climate change is changing risks underlying, all of these different types of hazards. But it is a real property. It is a real change for people owning property in the value of their property, often, like, as you can sort of see, putting these things together. So it becomes a super political thing to put out risk maps and update them and say your property is going to have more risk and yours is going to have less risk, because then it reshapes like how much your house is worth, right? So I guess I was just wondering about, I know the climate services debate it has been going so long. I didn't know it was the 70s. I was familiar in the 2000s, but yeah, I'm wondering if there's, it feels like people are fighting about this, even if it is a government product. And I guess I'm just wondering if you see any way around it, like of how to kind of, because it would help with adaptation to actually have accurate risk maps and to actually shape people's buying decisions through the power of the market and information, which is exactly what this is. But yet people fight the information itself when it becomes clear that does do that, So there's a vested interest in the status quo and not revealing those market prices or, those risks. So I guess, have you thought, like, is there a way around it, or like, what is the way around it to try to help these risk maps get updated and be accepted by people, even though it just actually causes a property loss, really?
Yeah, I mean, that's sort of at the heart of this paper, meaning, so, I mean, I also was so shocked that it was around, because I just saw this in like a science article around since the 1970s. And I was like, okay, I actually know a lot about the history of climate change. Like, I'm not sure we were even sure that it was CO2 in the 1970s. Like, we weren't, but so there was like, and I found this fascinating. There was like this coalition between like Sunbelt Republicans and Democrats. It was this bipartisan coalition, like, that was pretty sure the climate was changing, wasn't so interested in like what the cause was, but like really wanted more granular information for like farms and for water management stuff. And it passed, and that's basically where the US GCRP comes from, like the people who put out the like US Global Change Report every 5 years or whatever. Like, so it passed. It never was really the like big climate services vision that the Republican sponsors wanted. I just find that interesting because it's so impossible.
A year program in science. So that GCRP, there has been for 30 years, $2 billion spent on climate science as a result of GCRP. But I agree, it didn't actually translate to something for decision making, in like this.
Well, and in particular, the part that was really muted was that it didn't build, they really had this like hub and spokes model in mind that like it would be for the people. It'd be like very like you could go to your local land grant university and they would have a big atmospheric scientist on staff. Like that vision never happened. And I guess I just bring it up with response to your like political question, because it's so big and huge. And I guess I would say a few things. Like, one, it's not clear to me that like First Street Foundation's maps are like not political and that they don't cause the same amount of outrage. We just maybe don't see it as much. Like in researching this article, like you can find so many 1-star reviews of just like First Street Foundation's like Google review site. Like it's not even on the page, right? It's just 1-star reviews like of First Street Foundation in Google of people being like, this is BS, like I'm so upset. Or even some people being like, I am the like water flood manager hydrologist person for the Cape Cod and like this is wrong. And like they don't have a format for like where to put it. And so that really makes me nervous on the public-private side is like people get mad at the government because we like give them fora sometimes. Like there was a comment page on the Oregon website. So that's one thing I'll say. 2, I do think this idea that we're gonna have like a rational information price response, like that will help in adaptation. I don't think that is true. Like I think that we are already seeing that like in Florida, people simply like stop buying insurance. Or you have like, I guess it's just like, it's going to be political with or without the maps. Like, I don't know. I was on Blue Sky the other day and someone was like, my grandparents are like fully convinced it's Biden's fault that they can't afford flood insurance in Florida. And it has like literally nothing to do with Biden, right? And so like, and those maps, it has nothing to do with government maps. It just has to do with like climate change. And I don't know, I think it's going to be political, like one way or the other. I think that I have this like hippie idea of getting people at least more involved, like have it be more like, more collaborative, like having like a community adaptation plan around the maps that tries to get them to be less like reactive to it. But I don't know. I think it's a little bit of hope, like wild hopes, but I totally appreciate your question.
Karina.
Thanks for the talk. This has been really interesting, especially hearing you speak of it after reading your paper and kind of give a little bit more color. I guess picking up this question about maybe the politicization of something like a national climate service, what maybe if you thought of this, maybe not, what do you think are the pros and cons of packaging this information tools as kind of hazard risk versus climate risk, and hazard risk maybe with climate as a future potential that is inherent? And like obviously in lieu of having national climate models and CAT models, the FIO has used the National Risk Index that FEMA has produced, and there's a lot of methodological flaws, but it is like packaged as a hazard tool and thus doesn't produce the same outcry, even though you might actually identify in the short term the same, especially if you looked at just like flood risk, the same kind of hazardous areas.
I think that makes even more sense.
Go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think that makes, so like, there's maybe one version of that in which you feel like you're being like a chicken to not call it climate risk. But like in reality, the thing we're worried about is the hazard, meaning like the actual answer is that a lot of these things are only partly climate and partly like all the other things that cause hazards. Like, the fire in Maui was like climate plus like a bunch of other mess ups. The reasons why the hurricanes are really bad in Florida is like partly climate change, but also that people keep moving there. So the idea that these aren't like partially also non-climate and like, yeah, I think it's fine to call them hazards in particular. And then you're sort of also less really focused on this, like was it not climate? You can sort of just like skip that area in which you can be like, maybe it was, but this is like hazards.
I guess as a quick follow-up, I wonder, because this is a space I don't know a ton about, how does that interact with the mandates around climate disclosure and the kind of like definition of climate disclosure when you kind of frame it as hazard system?
That's a really good question. I just sort of think that even on the like, I just still think it's very under theorized, like what we even mean by climate disclosure. Like if you very specifically mean like historic flood risk, you don't have to call that climate disclosure. That's just like simply historic flood risk that probably has climate effects in there. Once you start getting, so the Bank of England, like one of the early critiques of scientists being like regulators don't understand science was the Bank of England requiring like forward-looking disclosures of like climate impacts on flood, in which scientists were sort of like, you're just asking way too much precision. Like where you're asking banks to disclose a thing that like we just would have like such larger uncertainty bars around. But it still feels such like, even in the Securities and Exchange Commission's like version of climate disclosure, like the physical hazards part is not super well defined. Like it's mostly like, and I think they're going to take out that part even. That was like report all the damages from climate change. Because I think literally someone like Target was like, we don't know what is a tornado hazard and what is a climate tornado hazard. I still think that that's sort of, like, I don't even know what the point was really. Like, why is the SEC asking for that? I mean, I don't blame the SEC. I think like all of us need to think like a little bit harder about like what would be the best thing to ask for. And I don't know if we've like figured that out yet.
Dave, go ahead.
I'm just following up on what Lisa was asking. I mean, it's really interesting, or like the ideas she was proposing. I'm like, this is like a lot of new information for the market, and the market's going to reach like some new equilibrium, and we're not there yet. And the folks that are first on this information and can act first, there's lots of like arbitrage opportunities, right? I mean, but there's also a lot of loss. I mean, it'd be arbitrage if there was like a lot of benefits, like finding out that your property is not at a risk or is at less risk relative to another one should, like, in theory, increase its value. And so there's some people that potentially are gaining from this new information because they're not losing, right? And then you have a bunch of folks that are losing. And when you're on the market to buy, like you want this information. When you're on the market selling, you don't want the buyer to have this information. So you want the information asymmetry, or like just there not to be enough information to assess this. And so it's interesting because like banks need this, insurance companies need this, asset managers need this, buyers need this, sellers are fighting it. It's interesting because it's like this information is going to work its way through the system anyway, but nobody wants it to be easy to access if you're selling. And I feel like that's like, they're going to fight it. And so who sticks their neck out? I don't know. I feel like it's information that's going to be used behind the scenes to reprice everything. And the prices will eventually catch up. But it'll take a while because these are large assets that they don't turn over that frequently. But these are just a lot of high level thoughts on what Lisa was saying. And I just really fun to see what you're providing here, because it's, we're just like we're in this transition to a new equilibrium.
Yeah,
I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
Yeah, I think just one thing I would just say in response is like, I do think that like how much these risks manifest are also so contingent on policy responses to them. So it does sort of confound the entire effort of being like, wildfire risk here, like flood risk here, what will it be in 7 years? Because it has so much, it's so, especially when you start getting like 15, 20 years out, you're like, well, it really depends on like what the state of Virginia decides to do about like, we're just going to invest money in this, or we're going to do managed retreat. So that's one thing that I think makes it really hard for the equilibrium to be reached, at least, let me say that, or distorts the equilibrium in some way, in that like, we don't price the risk because everyone sort of doubles down on it being a place that will be saved, when maybe the rational thing to do now would be to abandon it. I guess it just once you add in all the complexities of policy response, just starts to get really messy. And that's just where that just leads me to, we need really like proactive adaptation. This is like a thing that the market can't handle given all of those trade-offs. Like the market's just sort of paralyzed. And then also the limits of disclosure. Like there are towns in the West that are going to run out of water. Like, is it an individual homeowner's responsibility to like disclose that like my town has no water? Like, it's just a very interesting question about, again, how risk will manifest. Like, do you think that town will eventually like build a desalination plant and have like a contract with some consultant? Like maybe. It just depends so much on I don't know. The end. I guess I would say there are certain things that seem predictable enough that we're not responding to, that I would focus on those rather than things that we're not responding to. Like and I'm just even talking climate science, like we know a lot about glacier runoff disappearing. We know a lot about aquifer depletion. We can see those coming. It's a really interesting economic question. Why I know, like, it still seems like, you know, everyone's focused on Florida. I think it would be interesting more to think about the West too. Yeah.
I think we'll wrap up there. Thank you everyone so much for attending and for the really thoughtful questions. Madison, thank you so much for
Thank you.
a really fascinating seminar. And if Madison, if you have time just to stick around for a
Yeah,
few
I'm gonna
minutes.
stick around.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Madison.
Thanks.
Madison, I want to apologize. Carolyn was really looking forward to attending this, and she just got tied up in another meeting and is unable to join. But yeah,
No
thanks
worries. I'm a
for-
big fan. I'm such a fan.
Yeah.
So please pass on my fandom to her.
Will do.
Thank you.
Yeah, do you still have 30 minutes to chat?
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, I guess I didn't
You
get
might,
to ask any questions. So, Karina, do you want to?
Oh, no, just like Carolyn just pinged us and said, I might be able to join. So she might
Okay.
be surprised because I didn't want
I
anyone to
guess
surprise.
we should let her know that we're still in the Zoom because we were going to switch
yeah,
teams at 4, but I think it's just easier to stay here.
I'll do that. You can
I guess like one question I had for you was I very much I think share your concern about the privatization of climate risk analytics, and but like at best I think we're like at least several years away from a national climate service. And so I guess like I'm kind of wondering like what role government has to play in ensuring and improving access and quality to this like private information in kind of like the very near term. And like especially on like the quality side, I feel like it's not like a matter of like how far are we from the right answer when like the validation and like the size of the error bars are like a very open area of uncertainty, really, I guess.
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great question. I don't know. I mean, I think that just has to operate at so many levels. I mean, so I just like don't even understand like who at the Securities and Exchange, like in theory, the Securities and Exchange Commission is supposed to